Hey, thanks for understanding everyone while I deal with this illness that has plagued us this week. But I still wanted you to get your work in and your lecture in. So we are going to talk mostly about laying stuff out this week. But we're also going to start off with a review of the Shape Builder tool, and we're going to talk more about fabrics and textures. And then we're going to get to layout. Um, so, to start off, I am going to draw a belt buckle with the Shape Builder tool, and I have the belt buckle on its own layer here, so I can easily make a new layer and then lock my belt buckle image layer so I don't move it around. And I think that that's really useful. By the way, I have my computer recording my clicks, so let me know if you like that or if you think it's annoying. Um, So I'm going to draw a rectangle with the Shape Builder tool. Beautiful. And let's give it some fill. So make sure the fill is in the front and then choose a color. And I can come up to my properties panel and lower the opacity of the fill so I can still see the shape through it. So then I'm going to draw another rectangle for the other shape, but I'm going to zoom in. There we go. For the crossbar and a third rectangle for this center shape. Now, we can easily round the corners on these rectangles by clicking and dragging on these circles. You've probably seen them show up when you draw with the pen tool too, which I think is new. I wasn't used to teaching about them, but they allow you to round corners automatically. What they do is they add extra anchor points. So instead of one anchor point here, you have two, and you could then manipulate these further. Um, so we are going to round out these corners a bit, and it rounds them all out automatically. If you, I'm sure there's a way to round only one, but I do not know it. So we can start adding and subtracting to this shape. And then someone also asked me how to make something look shiny or brassy. So we will get to that too using a gradient. Um, so I am going to, with my black selection tool, select all of these shapes. And it's nice that I have put my image on its own layer because now I can actually ditch it if I want to. So I can select all these shapes and then move to my shape builder tool, which looks like two circles overlapping with a line through them and the white cursor on them. Shape Builder tool, also near my live paint bucket tool. And if all of these tools aren't showing, you can go to Window, Toolbars, Advanced, and then all of these tools will show up. Um, so first off, we want this center piece to be all one solid piece with the background for sure. So let's start with that. I am not holding shift. I held shift by accident. Just clicking and dragging with the mouse. and that combined this shape into one. And now I want to remove these pieces, so I can hold Alt and click, and it has removed those pieces. Okay, so just clicking or clicking and dragging will add shapes together, and Alt will remove shapes. So now we can make this look shiny. The gradient tool, if you double click on it, the gradient panel should show up, or you can go to Window, Gradient, and get the gradient panel. But basically it is going to apply your gradients. The gradient tool is going to apply your gradient to whatever is selected, so make sure you have the shape selected first, otherwise the gradient tool doesn't work that well. And for shiny stuff, see, it automatically applied this gradient. For shiny stuff, what is nice is to get a dark and a light. So I accidentally instantly added another gradient color here on the bottom. These are the gradient colors, and I can double click on them and choose from other colors, and you can choose from your swatch colors as well. So this is already looking pretty good, but we can make the shimmer on it even tighter, and we could change these, can change these to grays, which might look a little bit more like metallic. And you can have as many highlights as you want in there, right? So we can add, so it seems like if you click on the dots, you are moving around the dots, but if you click on the circle around the dot, you will create a new gradient color. So I can leave that gray there, and I can add in a new highlight, and maybe it doesn't have to be all the way white. And then we can stack these really close together, and maybe even add, you can change where the centers of the change in the color is. Alright, so that's looking interesting at least. And with the gradient tool, I can adjust the angle and placement of the gradient. I think if I click and drag, yeah, if you click and drag, you adjust where the gradient hits, so I can try to get kind of an angle on it. And you can also adjust manually on this. Like, I feel like it's a little too dark on the sides. So let's try throwing a stroke on this and adjusting the size, bringing it over here. So it's looking pretty good, especially at a small scale. So that's how you make a nice shiny belt buckle. And I really like using the shape builder tool. I use it sometimes to create flats, like I showed you last time in class, and we could make a flat pretty much exactly like this using the shape builder tool, this guy. So let's move on to fabrics and textures. You guys have any questions? I'm just kidding. So here are a couple textures that I found. A texture like this, where everything is really flat. If you are lucky enough to find a texture like this, you might not have to do any editing of the texture. We might be able to go to edit. I'm sorry, that's the Photoshop spot for patterns. Object pattern make, and it adds it as a swatch. And you can see that it looks pretty seamless without any work. I can see a tiny seam here, but you might be able to just be okay with that, or maybe it would like not show up when printing or when scaled down. So let's see how this looks. Because it's pretty even with the lighting all the way across, it's pretty close. So I'm gonna hit done, and let's try applying it to some pants. We choose it, and then we choose the pants. So we can then scale, and it's scaling the whole object down. If we check off preview, we'd be able to see that. And we don't want to scale the whole object, we just want to transform the pattern inside the object. So now we're scaling that down until it looks like a realistic twill. This is nice when, like, if I went and used a clipping mask like we talked about last week, right? Clipping masks work when you have two objects, or two or more objects on top of each other. Where is my texture here? So I am going to move this to my texture layer by clicking and dragging on that dot. And now this is, we can tell it's on the same layer as my swatches because it is highlighted in pink. So if you have two objects selected and go to Object Clipping Mask Make, the topmost object, so in this case the pants, is going to kind of crop or cut out the shape of the image behind it into the shape of pants. So the problem with using any old texture and using a clipping mask is that sometimes things look unrealistically giant. It's like this twill doesn't look realistic, where when we define it as a pattern and shrink the pattern down, it starts getting to a more realistic level. And you can tell you can't see any kind of seam in this pattern. If we defined this as a pattern, even after we cropped it, we would get a significant seam in the pattern. You'd be able to tell where the edges of the patterns are, even ignoring this white line that I have in there. So in order to make a pattern perfectly seamless, we actually need to do it, we need to adjust some pixels on our little swatch in Photoshop. It doesn't mean that we can't use this pattern, it just means that we have to do a little bit of work. So I'm going to launch Photoshop. So I'm going to make a new document in Photoshop, and come on, I have copied that image from Google Chrome. So here it is offering me a clipboard sized document. So this is going to be the exact same size as my image, which is nice. So I'm going to hit create, and I'm going to paste this image in there, and I'm going to go ahead and crop the edges using my crop tool over here, and this will remove the pixels from the outside as long as I have delete cropped pixels checked. And it's important that I do for the next step to work, which is creating the seamless pattern. It honestly might be easier to select just the top half of this because this is relatively even side to side. I'm going to go ahead and try my best selecting the bottom as well, but we will see. We can always adjust. So I'm going to hit enter, and it should have deleted all the pixels on the outside, so it did. So if I move the layer, you can tell there are no more pixels. Hitting Control Z to go back. So now we're going to use a special filter in order to be able to see the intersection of this pattern, right? So right now the edges don't line up seamlessly. You can tell where the edges are when we make it into a pattern. So we're going to go to Filter, Other, Offset, and I actually know that this image is about like 600 by 600 or 600 by 700. So I'm going to start by throwing both of these horizontally at about 300 and see how that looks. And what we're looking for is to be able to see the seam in the center. Hopefully you guys can see it with this image. It might not be as visible up and down, but horizontally you can see this hard line that's happening. Okay, you can also click into these and use your scroll mouse, scroll wheel, whatever they're called, so you get it pretty much in the center. So we're going to hit OK. And now what I'm going to do is, can sometimes be kind of artistic, but we're going to clean up the center seam without touching any edge pixels. So if we touch any edge pixels right now, we will add a seam in the center of our original image, if that makes sense, right? Like over here, there is, this is like where the center of my original cat hair image was, right? The corners are now the very center of my image. So we are going to use a combination of tools. If you're familiar with the clone stamp tool, it's a nice option. You hold Alt and click where you want it to copy from, and then you can kind of paste those pixels artistically, so it's copying from the section where the crosshairs are, but we really don't want to touch any of the edge pixels, so we're gonna leave. There might be a tiny seam on the edge, but it should be relatively unnoticeable. So cleaning up with the clone tool is a nice option. It's kind of artistically copying and pasting. Another option, I'm going to actually undo this a little bit so we can focus a different tool on the right side here. Another option is content aware fill. So we have to select an area. So I will select a chunk kind of around the seam, and we can go right up to the edge, but we don't really want to touch the edge. And then we are going to go to Edit, Content Aware Fill, and this is going to make another layer on top of layer 1, where it's going to do its best job to fill this seamlessly, which is a nice option. So Content Aware Fill opens up its own panel, but you can see how it tried its best to fill that area that I have selected, and it did a really good job. And if we wanted to make sure that it didn't fill this with something that was too dark, we could tell it, we don't want you to sample from the shadowy area right here. And we can see it tries to adjust, and it kind of chooses lighter section. I don't want it to be, I don't want it to have a seam here, so I don't want to choose right up against my selection, if that makes sense. But now it's not sampling from this stuff. This tool is really good for also like cropping awkward cameras that made it into the frame in a photo shoot, or other stuff where you don't want to change the whole image, but you wish like, oh, that wasn't there. We can talk more about it if you want to next class, but it's a great option for this, and it makes another layer up here, which is fine. So using that and using the clone tool, we can merge these. Oops, I hit the wrong button. We can merge these into one layer by selecting both of them and choosing merge layers. And then I'm going to use the clone tool to just polish up this vertical seam a little bit. And there's like maybe a tiny seam here, maybe. So let's save this as a JPEG. It's now a seamless pattern. So I'm going to go File, Save As, and choose JPEG. And we're going to call this Fur Seamless Repeat. And we're going to bring that into Illustrator. So there she is. Because I placed this instead of pasted it, I went to edit place, or this would also happen if you dragged a file that you had downloaded into here. There's an X on this JPEG. Here too, there's an X. There's no X on this JPEG. This image is embedded, much like a rasterized image in Photoshop. This image is not linked to a file on the desktop anymore. This is still linked to a file on the desktop. If we try to define this as a pattern, it would give us no trouble. But if we try to define this as a pattern, we're going to get an error message. So even though this is our seamless repeat, when we go to Object, Pattern Make, it's going to give us this message. Patterns cannot contain linked objects. So we have to embed this object. It's also good to embed any object in Photoshop because you can lose track of files really easily that way. Like if you saved it and brought it home and you didn't also bring this file home, it would lose track of them. So embedding them is a good option. Unfortunately, embedding images means that your file can end up being really large, like it can take up a lot of space, but I think it's worth it overall. So now we are going to define this as a seamless repeat. Edit, Object, Pattern, Make. And we're going to hit OK. It's telling us it added it to the swatches, and you can see that now there's no hard lines in here anywhere. It's all pretty smooth and seamless. So I am going to hit Done, and let's try applying it to, I guess, the t-shirt. Fur t-shirt. Maybe it's just a fur texture. And we could make it smaller, right click, transform, scale, and it's scaling the object, and we definitely don't want that. We just want the pattern scaled. And there we go. So this is a great way to indicate what the object is made out of. Okay, we're now going to go over how to lay out your patterns or your flats for your final collection. So there's a handout on the Moodle, and it discusses how to, or just some good tips for laying out your designs. So, excuse me, your layout should show off the clothes. You should be trying to find a layout that compositionally allows your eye to move around the page, and doesn't make any of the clothes too much more important than each other, but still really looks great. So you're not going to make the scale too much smaller, um, or you're not going to make the scale so small, at least, that you can't see any of the design details. And you might consider blowing up certain design elements. I have a example project for you to look at in a minute. You're not going to try to cram all your designs onto one page. So not one look, because that would require a lot of paper, but two, three, 4 looks per page, 2 to 3 looks per page, really ends up looking thoughtfully placed and nice. I'm also going to say, in terms of the scale, your garments should all be at the same scale. So you should kind of have everything scaled at the same time, and nothing should be too noticeably bigger or smaller. You need to have a 1/4 inch border. It's called bleed room in the industry. Uh, it doesn't have to be a formal border like a hard rectangle or anything. It just means don't place your work too close to the edge of the page, or else it might get cut off, right? You don't want to have stuff literally touching the edge. Um, don't leave too much empty space on the page. Coloring the background doesn't necessarily solve that problem. A colored background can still be negative space. An image in the background can still be negative space. Don't put a background in that competes with the clothes. So you want to put kind of a chill background in there, maybe something simple, a texture, something from Pexels that's high quality. Pexels or Imager, I can't remember what the high quality websites were right now. Don't put in a background that competes with the clothes. Yeah. Separates should be grouped so it is easy to see which tops and which bottoms go together. They don't have to be lined up straight in a line. They can be kind of grouped, laid out. If you think about those Instagram layouts of outfits, that's a really great way to think of your flats. This is the kind of image I'm talking about. Things can overlap a tiny bit and still show all of the detail. Don't be afraid to add other design elements on the page. The nicest looking projects include fabric, swatches, palette chips, borders, sheer overlays over images, textures in the backgrounds, design details blown up in an artistic way. Some really great options. Something I really do want to stress today, and I wish that we could print out in class for you to see that for sure, but there's a big difference in colors on the screen versus colors that come out of the printer. And the best option for you, in order for you not to be defending color choices with excuses like the screen color look different on the screen, is to run a test strip of your palette colors before you print. So you don't have to print the whole project twice, you just have to print a test of your swatches, and then you should be like essentially getting the colors right. Have someone else proofread your work before you print it. There isn't necessarily a lot of text on these projects, but have them look out for missed seams, sloppy seams, lines that go outside of the garment, things that didn't get filled, backgrounds, backs of garments that should be gray. So let's look at an example project. This is Lillian Pexton's from last year, and she always had some of the prettiest layouts. So notice she has 2 garments on each page, and we're going to look at each of her pages, and then she highlights a textile that she used in each page in the corner in a way to highlight her swatches. And she also has this design detail included, which is this belt buckle. So she spent a lot of time drawing these elements and bringing them into Illustrator and using a clipping mask to define them or like crop them inside this belt buckle. But in her flats, that detail is so small, so she blew it up and highlighted it on each page, which is a great option. So if there's something you worked hard on that you don't think is reading well in the original, consider that option. Something that I will say is that some of these could have had a tapered edge, which just gives things a much softer look. So she used a 1/2 inch stroke, but she could have used a 1 or a 1/2 point stroke. She could have used a 1 point stroke and the tapered ends in order to make that look softer and more consistent with the rest of the lines on the page. So she's again highlighted the belt buckle on each of her next pages, or where it's included anyway. But on each page she has highlighted the textiles she's used, sometimes overlapping them, and she's also has the swatches on each page. I am going to use her example to talk about like some other options for using layout tools in Illustrator. And what I would recommend is that if your computer can handle the number of files anyway, we are going to use artboards in order to be able to see the whole presentation on one page. Okay, so I'm going to use the artboard tool, and you're going to come up to the properties panel wherever your properties panel is, and I'm going to choose new artboard, and she has 5 pages, so I'm going to hit it 5 times, and then we are going to copy and paste the rest of these in there. So I've done my best to line all of these up in here, but I am going to now kind of mess around with these. So one thing that is an option, and Lillian's looks great. So this is just like, these are just other options that I'm talking about. But one thing that is another option is using drop shadows. So I am actually going to ungroup these and group them separately. So, oh, it's already, that guy's already grouped. Okay, so these are grouped separately, and it looks like all of them on this page are, so that's nice. We are going to add a drop shadow. Right now, she hasn't overlapped very much in the presentation, and I think that's because it can be visually confusing to overlap without a drop shadow. It just can look disorienting. Even if we bring this to the front, arrange, transform, I'm sorry, right click, arrange, bring to front. Even with that, it just can be like, what's happening here? I'm not sure. So same thing if we group these. If we overlap this, it can be just a little bit visually confusing. So she's kept them all separate, which works. But we can go to Effect, Stylize, and Drop Shadow. And if we check off Preview, we'll be able to see what it looks like, and we can adjust if we want it lighter or if we want it darker. Let's put it on a 50% drop shadow, 50% opacity. And then if you want more of a drop shadow or less, you can adjust from there, and also the direction it goes in and how far it blurs. So I'm going to hit OK. And because this was grouped, the drop shadow applied to the whole group. I'll zoom in. So same thing for the rest of these. I'm just going to choose them all at once. They're all grouped individually though. Choose them all at once. Effect, stylize, drop shadow. And they all get their own drop shadows. I think that drop shadows can really bring some dimension to a mood board. She could even have thrown a drop shadow on this element. Which could just give some interesting just depth. There is, after you choose a filter once, it oh, it's thinking so hard. I hope it doesn't crash. There we go. Beautiful. So I guess I will apply a drop shadow to all of these, and just do a tiny bit of rearranging. So you don't need to have all of your elements exactly on top of each other. I can take these shirts and move them down here. Right click, arrange, bring to front. We're going to have this collection kind of next to each other instead. I lost some of these. Oh well. You would fix that, but I don't have to for this lecture. I'm going to grab some of these and just rearrange just for fun. It's a little bit unclear which is the front and which is the back in this garment, in this whole look. So having a consistent front in the front and back in the back kind of eliminates any of that. Front and back of the belt, and front and back of the skirt. Now, this skirt was not grouped entirely together. It has separate pieces. So when I applied the drop shadow, it applied a drop shadow to each individual piece, depending, and those drop shadows are showing up on the other pieces depending on like the layer order that they're stacked in, right? If I sent this one to the back, then we wouldn't have a drop shadow there, but things get confusing. So we really do want to make sure that our objects are grouped before we put a drop shadow on them. I will say I've seen the drop shadow do weird things to groups before, where it has selected its own, it's decided that it isn't grouped, and it's applied drop shadows in the middle of a grouped selection, and I don't really have any explanation for it when Illustrator glitches like that. So to remove a drop shadow, we need our appearance panel, window appearance, to find it. And we can click on the drop shadow here and choose delete selected item. And that should delete your drop shadow. Am I going crazy? All right, it is working, but maybe it doesn't work for more than one object at a time. So I've removed most of the drop shadows from it by choosing that and then choosing delete. So you can see it's definitely worthwhile to group it beforehand. And then we can apply the drop shadow, no problem. Effect, stylize, drop shadow, check off preview. Yes, we can put all of these back up to 0.1. And this was at 50. So, honestly, this needs some work. I think I should have hit Control Z on that. It would have been a lot easier. So we can get the arranging together. This is what I'm like, why is that so much extra drop shadow? Probably because there are pieces in there that now have 2 drop shadows applied to them. Not the end of the world. You can always like double click into these and then click on elements until you find parts that do have the drop shadow. So there was one. Yeah. And there was the other. And there's even more. But I'm going to leave it for now. So once we think our first page looks good, or maybe you want to think about it more overall, you can use guides in order to make sure that the next pages are lined up as well. I'm getting frustrated by these background shapes, so I'm going to put all of them on their own layer so I don't keep having to fight with them during the lecture. it's a good review of how you move stuff from layer to layer. So she has all of these grouped together on each individual page, and then on my layers panel I can create a new layer, and we can move all of them to that layer by clicking and dragging on this square. This square represents everything that you have selected right now. You can click and drag like this, and then we can reorder the layers and lock that background layer. So I'm going to drag out some guides. So we're going to turn on our rulers, view rulers, show rulers. I'm going to kind of tell it where I have my tops starting and where I have my bottoms starting. And what's nice is that now it's indicated across the whole page. Something I will say about her layout is that all of her artwork is kind of different sizes. It's like this one and this one are really big, but these ones are really small. And I'm not a huge fan of that. I wish they were a little bit more consistent. Maybe all a tiny bit smaller, or all just like more on the same scale. This would allow us to like better interpret size and silhouette in the collection. So it's actually nice to scale all of your flats at once, bring them all into one page, select everything, and then scale, holding shift from there. Holding shift is important. So we could even make some on these on this page bigger. She has kept garments in the same outfit the same size. Like she hasn't gone and made these shirts so much bigger than the shorts or anything like that. So I don't know if this is the nicest layout. I would definitely keep playing with it, but what we can do is kind of use guides as reference and start adjusting the other pages to kind of match up with those guide layouts. You don't need to go crazy and make sure that you don't need to make sure that each page is exactly the same layout. It might even be nice to have one or two, like she kind of switches from bottom left to upper right. But I probably would have, I don't know, considered continuing switching like that, like left this up here and clustered these a little bit closer together. Of course, I'm just messing up her beautiful work. So, she could also have done a different type of background. So I'm going to grab an image that I already have downloaded and bring it. So this doesn't go with her collection, but it's an image that I already have. So I'm going to drag it in here. And again, it shows up with the X on it. So it's nice to hit embed so that we don't lose track of this image. And then you can hold shift while scaling and it keeps its proportion, and we're going to pop this in the background. So I'm going to shut off that initial layer I made and make another layer, and I'm going to move this to my new layer by clicking and dragging on the little dot and dragging it to the layer I want. So I can make this the size of the background. And we can crop it also to the size of the artboard. And this is definitely too dark for the artwork. Let's work on this page, this front page. But what we can do, and what was really successful for a lot of students last year, is grab a rectangle, make sure it's filled with white. Come on. I don't know why that's... Okay, there it goes. So we're going to have a white fill and no stroke, and then we're going to draw a small rectangle on here. And it's nice to use guides to make sure everything is consistent, so we can drop this at exactly a 1/4 inch away from the edge on each page, or it might be a 1/2 inch, I'm not sure. And then we can draw our rectangle. I messed that one up. And we can make this semi-opaque. Honestly, just the image in the border can be really interesting, but clicking on this rectangle and lowering the opacity to 60 or 50 is a really nice option. You could even use rectangles to highlight different areas of the page. So we could have a rectangle for that outfit and a separate rectangle for this outfit. Borders are great also to remind you that you shouldn't have anything touching the edge of the page, or really even as close as I had it there. So to keep it consistent, keep your bleed room on every page. A border is great. I think that's everything I have to say about layout. Just make sure that everything has some nice flow. Graphic designers recommend using higher or more space, thicker margins on the top and the bottom of the page, and thinner margins on the edge. And that has a really pleasing effect to the eye, I guess. They also recommend working in grids, so getting your grid laid out ahead of time and being consistent with playing with that grid is a really great option as well. So let me know if you have any questions this week. Please reach out to me. You're going to print this. It should be printed for next class, including your inspiration board should be brought in as well, and it's worth 20% of your grade. So please have it printed at the beginning of next class. I have a So Heidi video here on turning a pattern, an image into a pattern swatch in Illustrator. And we've got the handout in my lecture from last year, but my 2020 lecture from this year will be up very soon. I'm recording it right now. That's happening right now. So I will see you guys next week. Thank you for being understanding, and please reach out to me if you have any questions. Bye.